The letter trembled in Emily's hands as 30 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled around her. "My dearest daughter," it began, but Emily wasn't anyone's daughter anymore, at least not the daughter she'd always believed herself to be. If you're enjoying this journey into Emily's shattered world, please hit that like button and subscribe to follow more stories that explore the fragile foundations our lives are built upon. Emily Winters had always been the perfect daughter in the perfect family, or so everyone in the small town of Mapleton believed. At 45, she had built her life around this identity, the responsible eldest child of Robert and Margaret Winters, respected high school principal and local philanthropist. Her childhood home on Sycamore Street, with its white picket fence and meticulously maintained garden, had been the backdrop for countless family photos that lined the hallways of her own home now. Photos that suddenly felt like props on a stage set. The letter had arrived 3 days after her mother's funeral. Margaret Winters had succumbed to cancer after a brief but brutal battle, leaving behind her husband of 50 years, 3 adult children, and apparently, one devastating secret kept in a sealed envelope with instructions for it to be delivered to Emily upon her death. "I've carried this burden alone for too long," her mother's elegant handwriting continued. "Your father doesn't know. Nobody knows. But you deserve the truth, Emily. You were not born to us. You came to us through circumstances I've never had the courage to reveal, until now." Emily's hands shook so violently that she had to place the letter on her kitchen counter. Outside, spring was painting Mapleton in cheerful colors, oblivious to the winter that had suddenly descended on her soul. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from her parents, ticked loudly, marking the seconds of this new, unrecognizable life. The revelation wasn't delivered in a single blow. Margaret's letter unfolded the truth gradually, each paragraph another tremor in the earthquake destroying Emily's foundation. She had been born to a teenage girl, Margaret's younger sister, Catherine, who had been sent away to visit relatives during her pregnancy. When Catherine died from complications shortly after giving birth, Margaret and Robert, newly married and desperate for a child, had taken the baby as their own. Birth certificates were altered, stories were fabricated, and Catherine's existence was nearly erased from family history. "I told myself it was for the best," Margaret wrote. "That you would have a better life with us than as the orphan child of a disgraced teenager. Your grandparents, my parents, insisted on the deception. Different times, different values. But the lie grew and grew until it consumed everything it touched." Emily thought of her father, now a fragile widower living in the family home alone. Did he truly not know? Or was this another layer of deception? And what of her siblings, James and Rebecca? Were they even her biological relatives at all? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, invasive and destructive. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. Emily grabbed her car keys and drove aimlessly through the streets of Mapleton, past landmarks that had defined her life, the elementary school where she'd first learned to read, the church where she'd married David, the park where she'd pushed her own children on the swings. Everything familiar now seemed foreign. Viewed through the lens of this new knowledge, she found herself parking outside her childhood home. The daffodils her mother had planted decades ago bobbed cheerfully in the spring breeze. Her father would be inside, probably sitting in his recliner, surrounded by sympathy cards and casseroles from well-meaning neighbors. How could she face him with what she knew? How could she not? Robert Winters looked smaller somehow, diminished by grief and age. When Emily entered without knocking, as she had done her entire life, he smiled weakly, but his eyes registered concern at her appearance. "Emmy? What's wrong, sweetheart?" The childhood nickname nearly broke her. She sat across from him, the letter clutched in her hand like evidence at a trial. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." His face changed then, a flicker of something, recognition? Fear, crossing his features before settling into careful neutrality. "Of course. Did you know I was adopted?" The word hung in the air between them, alien and accusatory. Robert's hands, spotted with age, gripped the armrests of his chair. His silence was answer enough. "Mom left me a letter," Emily continued, her voice steadier than she felt. She told me everything, about Catherine, about the deception. Were you part of it from the beginning? Robert closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with tears. Your mother wanted to tell you so many times. I was the one who insisted we keep it secret. I was afraid, his voice broke, afraid you wouldn't feel like ours anymore. The confession unleashed something in Emily, rage, perhaps, or simply the need to finally speak truth in a house built on lies. 50 years, Dad. 50 years of lies. Do James and Rebecca know? No, he whispered. No one knows except your grandparents, and they're long gone. Who was Catherine? Really? Mom's letter tells me the basics, but who was she? What was she like? Do I look like her? Do I have her laugh? Her talents? Her weaknesses? All these years, I've been walking around with someone else's DNA, someone else's history, and I didn't even know it. Robert reached for a photo album on the side table, one Emily had looked through countless times. He turned to a page near the beginning, to a photo Emily had always skimmed past, a group of teenagers at what appeared to be a school dance in the early 1970s. This is Catherine, he said, pointing to a girl on the edge of the group. Your biological mother. Emily stared at the face, young, pretty, with a hint of mischief in her smile. There was something familiar in the set of her eyes, the curve of her cheek. Emily had always thought she resembled her mother's side of the family. Now she understood why. She was brilliant, Robert continued softly. Creative, impulsive, full of big dreams. Margaret adored her, protected her. When Catherine got pregnant at 16, your grandparents were beside themselves. It was 1977, things were different then. They sent her to stay with an aunt in Colorado, told everyone she was attending a special arts program. Emily tried to imagine this girl, barely more than a child herself, sent away in shame, giving birth alone, then dying before she could even hold her daughter. What happened to her? Exactly? Robert's face crumpled. Hemorrhage, after you were born. The hospital did everything they could, but it was too late. Margaret was there, she'd gone to be with Catherine for the birth. When Catherine died, your grandparents saw it as providence. Margaret and I had been trying for a baby without success. They suggested we take you, give you our name, raise you as our own. And you just agreed? To build our entire family on a lie. We loved you from the moment we saw you, Robert said, his voice pleading. You were ours in every way that mattered. The paperwork, the stories, they seemed like details at the time. We convinced ourselves it was better this way, that knowing would only hurt you. Emily stood abruptly, needing distance. Better for whom? Do you have any idea what this feels like? To discover your entire identity is fabricated? That the story you've told about yourself, to yourself, is fiction? Emmy, don't call me that. I don't even know who I am anymore. She left her father sitting there, surrounded by the artifacts of a life partially invented. The drive home was a blur. Inside her own house, she avoided the concerned questions from her husband, David, and retreated to their bedroom, locking the door behind her. Sleep eluded her that night, and the next, and the next. She moved through her days mechanically, unable to share the burden with anyone. How could she tell her siblings that the family narrative they'd shared was a carefully constructed myth? How could she tell her own children that their family medical history, so confidently recited to doctors over the years, was partially unknown? A week after receiving the letter, Emily called in sick to the accounting firm where she'd worked for 20 years. Instead of staying home, she drove to the county records office. If she couldn't trust the story she'd been told, perhaps she could trust documentation. The clerk was sympathetic but firm. Birth records from that period would be sealed in adoption cases. You'd need a court order. But there was no official adoption, Emily explained. That's the problem. My birth certificate lists my parents, the people who raised me, as my biological parents. I need to find the original. The clerk frowned. That would be unusual. Are you sure about this? Emily wasn't sure about anything anymore, but she nodded anyway. After several hours of searching, the clerk returned with a thin file. This is unusual, she said. There's a birth certificate for an unnamed female infant, Mother Catherine Lawson, father unknown, date matching what you're looking for. And there's a death certificate for Catherine Lawson, same date. But there's no record connecting that infant to you. Emily stared at the documents, the official record of her biological mother's existence and death. Catherine Lawson. She had a name now, at least. Can I get copies of these? Armed with this fragment of truth, Emily drove to the public library. The local newspaper archives might hold some mention of Catherine Lawson, some clue to the woman whose blood ran in her veins, the microfiche reader hummed as Emily scrolled through months of the Mapleton Chronicle from 1977. There was no obituary for Catherine, another erasure, but in the January edition, she found a small item about academic achievements at Mapleton High. Catherine Lawson had won a state poetry competition. A poet. Emily had always loved poetry, had filled journals with her own verses since childhood. Her mother, Margaret, had always seemed puzzled by this interest, though supportive. Now Emily understood why. She was seeing Catherine's gift emerging in her daughter. As days turned into weeks, Emily's investigation into Catherine's life became an obsession. She neglected her work, her family, her friends. David tried to understand, but his patience was wearing thin. You need to talk to someone about this, he urged one evening, finding her surrounded by old yearbooks borrowed from the library. A therapist, maybe. This is consuming you. How can it not consume me? Emily demanded. My entire life has been a fabrication. The people I trusted most lied to me every single day for 45 years. They're still the people who raised you, who loved you, David said gently. Finding out about Catherine doesn't erase that. But it had changed everything. Emily couldn't look at family photos without seeing the deception. Couldn't hear her father's voice without detecting the undertones of guilt. Couldn't even look in the mirror without wondering which features came from Catherine, which from an unknown father. The breaking point came at Sunday dinner, a family tradition that had continued even after Margaret's death. Emily arrived late, having spent the morning at the cemetery, searching for Catherine's grave, another dead end, as she'd apparently been buried in Colorado. James and Rebecca were already there with their families, helping their father prepare the meal. The normality of the scene, so familiar yet now so false, struck Emily like a physical blow. I can't do this anymore, she announced from the doorway. I can't pretend. The kitchen fell silent. Her siblings looked confused, her father looked terrified. Emily, Robert began, please no. They deserve to know too. She turned to James and Rebecca. I found out after Mom died that I'm not actually your full sister. I'm your cousin. Mom's sister Catherine was my real mother. She died giving birth to me, and Mom and Dad took me and pretended I was theirs. They've been lying to all of us my entire life. The shock on their faces mirrored what Emily imagined her own had been. Rebecca dropped the serving spoon she was holding, it clattered against the tile floor in the silence. That's not possible, James said finally. Dad, Robert Winters seemed to age another decade in those few seconds. It's true, he admitted. We should have told you all long ago. You thought it was better to lie, Emily finished for him. To build this family on a foundation of deception. We built this family on love, Robert insisted, his voice breaking. Nothing about how we feel for you was ever a lie, Emmy. Rebecca had begun to cry silently. James looked shell-shocked. Their spouses and children, Emily's nieces and nephews, though were they really, watched in confused silence. That I can't be part of this anymore, Emily said. I need time. Space. I need to figure out who I really am. She left them there, ignoring her father's pleas to stay, to talk, to try to understand. In her car, she finally allowed herself to break down completely, sobbing until she could barely breathe. When the tears subsided, she drove, not home to David, but to a hotel on the outskirts of town. For 3 days, Emily spoke to no one. She ignored calls from David, from her children, from her siblings. She took long walks, sat in coffee shops surrounded by strangers, and tried to imagine a life completely disconnected from the Winters family. On the 4th day, there was a knock at her hotel room door. Emily opened it to find Rebecca standing there, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "You can't just disappear," her sister, cousin, said without preamble. "That's not how family works." "I don't even know what family means anymore," Emily replied, but she stepped aside to let Rebecca in. They sat across from each other, these women who had shared a childhood, who had believed they shared blood. "I've been angry too," Rebecca said finally. "At Mom and Dad for the lie. But mostly at you, for dropping this bomb and then vanishing when we all needed to process it together. I couldn't stay. Every memory feels contaminated now." Rebecca leaned forward. "Does it? Really? When you remember us building that ridiculous snow fort in '85, or when you taught me to drive in Dad's station wagon, or when we stayed up all night when Mom was in the hospital with pneumonia, are those memories really different now?" Emily wanted to say yes, that everything was different, but the truth was more complicated. "I don't know who I am anymore, Becca. You're Emily Winters. You're a terrible cook but a great accountant. You cry at dog food commercials. You can recite every line from The Princess Bride. You're my sister who used to let me sleep in her bed during thunderstorms. DNA doesn't change any of that." Emily felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of anger and grief beginning to unravel. "But Catherine deserves to be known, remembered," Rebecca finished. "We can do that together. We can find out who she was, honor her memory. But that doesn't mean erasing everything else." That night, Emily returned home to David, who held her without questions or recriminations. The next day, she called her father and asked if they could talk, really talk, about Catherine, about the past, about how to move forward with truth between them. The conversation was painful, raw, but necessary. Robert shared everything he knew about Catherine, her dreams of becoming a writer, her rebellious spirit, her kindness. He showed Emily letters Catherine had written to Margaret from Colorado, full of fear but also hope for her unborn child's future. "She would be so proud of you," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "Of the woman you've become." "I wish I could have known her," Emily replied, and meant it. Healing came slowly. Emily began therapy to process her feelings of betrayal and loss. She reached out to her siblings, rebuilding those relationships on a foundation of honesty. She even contacted the aunt in Colorado who had housed Catherine during her pregnancy, now elderly but still sharp-minded, who shared stories and even a few photographs Emily had never seen. 6 months after discovering the truth, Emily gathered her entire family, her father, siblings, husband, children, nieces, and nephews, in her backyard. On a table, she had arranged photographs, Margaret and Robert on their wedding day, Catherine as a teenager, Emily throughout her life, and all the generations that had followed. "I've been thinking a lot about what makes a family," she told them. "It's not just blood or legal documents. It's shared history, shared love, shared truth." She looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. "We lost our way with the truth part for a while, but we're finding our way back. All of us, together." She unveiled a small memorial stone she had commissioned for a corner of the garden. It read simply, "Catherine Lawson, 1961 to 1977. Poet, dreamer, mother. Remembered with love." "I wanted a place where we could acknowledge her," Emily explained. "Where my children and their children can know this part of their history." Robert was the first to approach the stone, placing his hand on it gently. "Thank you," he said to Emily. "For finding a way to forgiveness." "I'm still working on it," she admitted. "But I'm getting there." That evening, as the extended Winters family shared a meal together, a tradition resumed but transformed, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before her mother's death. The secret that had nearly destroyed her family had ultimately forced them to